"Hey," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I know you're out there. You don't have to hide." You gripped the wrench tighter, your body tense. What if this was a trap? What if he was working with the man who had taken you? The stranger stepped off the porch, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Look, I don't know who you are, but you look like you need help. If you're in trouble, I can—" "I don't trust you," you blurted out, your voice shaking. You took a step back, keeping the wrench raised. "Just stay where you are." He stopped, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied you. "Fair enough," he said slowly. "But I'm not going to hurt you. You're bleeding, and you look like hell. Let me at least patch you up." You hesitated, the exhaustion and pain weighing heavily on you. He didn't seem dangerous, not like him. But what if you were wrong? What if this man wasn't as harmless as he appeared? "Please," he said, his tone softer now. "I don't know what you've been through, but you're safe here. I promise safe." The word felt foreign, almost impossible to believe. But the warmth of the cabin and the genuine concern in his voice made you falter. Your grip on the wrench loosened, but you didn't lower it completely. Every instinct screamed at you to be careful, to keep your guard up, but the exhaustion in your body and the desperate hope for safety pushed you forward. Slowly, you took a shaky step closer to the man. He stayed perfectly still, his hands still raised, as though aware of the fragile balance between your fear and your need for help. "That's it," he said softly. "No one's going to hurt you here. You can trust me." You stopped a few feet away, the porch light casting you both in a dim glow. Now that you were closer, you could see him more clearly. He was older than you, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, with sharp, weathered features and kind, dark eyes. His flannel shirt and rugged jeans suggested he lived simply, far removed from wherever your captor might be. "Why should I trust you?" you asked, your voice hoarse and trembling. "For all I know, you could be working with him." His brow furrowed in confusion. "Him?" he repeated. "Who's him?" You hesitated, the words catching in your throat. You weren't sure how much to tell him. What if he was lying? But at the same time, you couldn't run anymore. You needed help, and if this man could give it to you, you had to take the chance. "The man who took me," you said finally, your voice barely above a whisper. "I escaped, but he's coming after me. He'll find me." The man's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as realization dawned on him. "You've been hurt," he said, his voice low but steady. "Come inside. We'll lock the door, and I'll make sure no one gets to you." Your instincts flared again, urging you to run, to hide. But your body was at its limit, and the promise of safety, no matter how small, was too tempting to ignore. You nodded hesitantly, lowering the wrench, but keeping it in your hand as you followed him up the steps. The inside of the cabin was small but cozy. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, filling the room with warmth. The scent of wood smoke and pine hung in the air, mingling with the faint smell of something cooking on the stove. The cabin was cluttered, but lived in, with books stacked on every available surface and a rifle mounted on the wall above the fireplace. "Here, sit down," the man said, gesturing to a worn leather armchair near the fire. You hesitated for a moment, scanning the room for anything that seemed suspicious, before finally sinking into the chair. The warmth of the fire seeped into your skin, and for the first time in what felt like forever, you let yourself relax, if only slightly. The man knelt in front of you, pulling a first aid kit from a shelf. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone gentle as he opened the kit. You hesitated again, your mind racing. Should you tell him? Would giving him your name make you more vulnerable? But the exhaustion weighed down on you, and the answer slipped out before you could stop it. "It's Noah." "I'm Ethan," he said with a small nod. You're safe now, Noah. I promise you watched him warily as he reached for your face. May I? He asked, gesturing toward the bandage on your head. You gave a hesitant nod, and he carefully peeled back the makeshift bandage, his touch surprisingly gentle. This doesn't look too bad, he said after a moment, his brow furrowing in concentration. I'll clean it up and rewrap it. He worked quickly, his hands steady as he cleaned and dressed the wound. You flinched when the antiseptic stung, but he murmured an apology, his voice low and soothing. It was strange. After everything you'd been through, his kindness felt almost unreal. When he finished, he sat back on his heels, studying you for a moment. You're lucky you got out, he said finally. But if this guy's as dangerous as you say, he won't stop looking for you. A shiver ran down your spine at the thought. What do I do? You whispered. Ethan's expression hardened with determination. First you rest. You're no good to yourself if you're too exhausted to think straight. Then, we figure out how to make sure he doesn't find you again. You stared at him, unsure whether to feel relieved or terrified. Ethan must have noticed something about your hesitation, because his brow furrowed slightly as he studied you. He leaned back on his heels, his hands resting on his thighs, trying to make himself appear less threatening. The firelight danced across his features, illuminating the strong lines of his jaw and the warmth in his eyes. You don't have to tell me everything right now, he said softly. But you're safe here, I promise. No one's going to hurt you again. You nodded, though the knot of tension in your chest hadn't fully loosened. Something about his presence was grounding, though, his calm voice, his patient demeanor. For the first time in days, you felt like you weren't entirely alone. Ethan stood up and went to the kitchen area, grabbing a kettle and setting it on the stove. I'll make some tea, he said over his shoulder. You look like you could use something to warm you up. As he moved around the small space, you allowed yourself a moment to take in your surroundings. The cabin was small and rustic, but it felt lived in. There was a stack of firewood by the hearth, a plaid blanket draped over the back of the couch, and shelves lined with books that ranged from well-worn classics to field guides about the forest. It was the kind of place you could imagine someone retreating to when they needed to escape the chaos of the world. Do you live out here alone? You asked, your voice still shaky but stronger than before. Ethan glanced back at you, nodding. Yeah, moved out here a few years ago. Needed a fresh start, you know? You nodded, understanding that sentiment all too well. It's nice. Peaceful. It usually is, he said, a small smile playing at his lips. Though it looks like you've had anything but peace lately. You didn't respond, the memory of what you'd escaped from still too fresh to talk about. Ethan must have sensed this because he didn't push. Instead, he poured 2 mugs of tea, brought them over, and handed one to you before sitting in the chair across from you. You sipped the tea, the warmth spreading through your body and easing some of the chill that had settled in your bones. Ethan watched you for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke. You said someone took you, he began carefully. A man. Do you want to tell me about him? Your grip tightened on the mug, and you shook your head. Not yet, you murmured. It's too much. Ethan nodded, his gaze softening. That's okay. Take your time. But just know, whoever he is, he's not getting you back. Not if I have anything to say about it. The intensity in his voice caught you off guard. There was something about the way he said it, like he wasn't just making an empty promise, but a vow he intended to keep. Thank you, you said, your voice barely above a whisper. Ethan smiled again, but there was something behind it this time, a flicker of vulnerability, like he understood more than he let on. You don't have to thank me, he said. Just focus on getting some rest tonight. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. The fire crackled between you, the silence stretching out but feeling less suffocating now. You allowed yourself to lean back in the chair, the exhaustion finally catching up to you. Your eyes felt heavy, and before you could stop yourself, you started to drift off. But as you began to fade, you heard Ethan's voice, low and almost to himself. "You remind me of someone," he murmured. You wanted to ask him who, but the pull of sleep was too strong. The last thing you saw was Ethan watching the fire, his expression soft but distant, like he was lost in a memory. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, you slept. But the forest wasn't silent. Somewhere in the darkness, unseen eyes were watching, waiting. When Noah woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the small windows of the cabin. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, and the air carried the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. For a moment, he was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings pulling him between relief and unease. But then the events of the previous night came rushing back, and his chest tightened. He wasn't safe yet, not completely. Ethan was already awake, standing by the kitchen counter with a mug of coffee in hand. He turned when he heard Noah stir. "Morning," he said with a small, reassuring smile. "How are you feeling?" Noah sat up on the couch, wincing as the movement reminded him of the bruises and aches that peppered his body. "Better, I think," he said softly. His voice felt steadier than it had the night before, though the fear was still there, lingering beneath the surface. Ethan nodded, setting his mug down and crossing the room. "Good. You needed the rest. There's some oatmeal on the stove if you're hungry." Noah shook his head, his stomach too knotted with anxiety to think about food. He looked at Ethan, his expression serious. "I need to call the police," he said firmly. "And my family. They need to know I'm okay." Ethan's face softened, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He pulled a chair over and sat down across from Noah, resting his elbows on his knees. "I get it," he said slowly. "But you're way out in the woods, closest phone's in town, and that's about a 2-hour hike from here." Noah's heart sank. "2 hours?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "There's no cell service out here." Ethan shook his head. "No signal this deep in the forest. I don't even have a phone, never needed one out here." Noah ran a hand through his hair, his fingers brushing against the bandage Ethan had carefully applied the night before. "I can't just sit here," he said, his voice rising slightly. "That man, he's dangerous. He could still be out there. And my family, they probably think I'm dead." Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying Noah with a steady gaze. "I understand," he said. "But walking to town isn't something you should do alone, especially not with him out there. If he's as dangerous as you say, we need to be smart about this." Noah swallowed hard, frustration and desperation swirling inside him. "So, what do we do? Just wait?" Ethan shook his head. "Number, I'll take you to town myself. We'll leave in a couple of hours, once I've had time to pack some supplies. It's safer if we stick together." Noah nodded, some of the tension in his shoulders easing. "Okay," he said quietly. "Thank you." Ethan offered him a small smile. "You don't have to keep thanking me," he said. "Like I told you, no one deserves to go through what you've been through." Noah looked down at his hands, his mind racing. He felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't told Ethan the whole truth yet, about everything that had happened. About the man who'd taken him and the things he'd said, the things he'd done. But he wasn't sure if he could bring himself to say it out loud. Ethan must have noticed the shift in Noah's demeanor, because he reached out, resting a hand on Noah's knee. The gesture was gentle, grounding. "You're safe now," he said softly, "and we'll make sure it stays that way." Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe they could get to town, call the police, and finally put an end to this nightmare